In this example, I want to take a look at how we can take our domain name. So I have brianwitkowski.com registered within Route53. So how I can take that domain name and point it at specific resources that I have within the AWS ecosystem. So specifically, I want to deal with taking my domain name and pointing it at an S3 bucket. So I have an S3 bucket here. I want to take that same domain name and point it at an EC2 instance. And within the EC2 instance, I have Apache installed and just a simple HTML page within the root directory. And then finally, I want to take a look at how I can render out an HTML site from Lambda. And in order to use Lambda effectively, I'm going to need to combine that with API Gateway. So just a note about that, I'm not actually pointing the domain name at Lambda, I'm pointing it at API Gateway, which is sitting in front of that Lambda function. Okay, so let's get started. So I have a domain name registered. I have an S3 bucket. My S3 bucket name matches my domain name, and that's important. I will not be able to point my domain name at my S3 bucket unless they have the same exact name. So keep that in mind when you're building out your S3 bucket if you want to have a domain name pointed at it. Additionally, this S3 bucket is set up so that there's a static web host. So you can see that I have an endpoint pointing at index.html, and we can see that. So if I go ahead and click on this, you'll see that here's my Cloud for Developers, and I have an S3 at the end, so we can kind of see that title because I have the same essentially HTML page for all the different AWS services with the title being different so that we can distinguish between the three different services to make sure we're getting a different site rendered. Okay, so I have my S3 bucket set up. I have static hosting enabled, so name is the same as the domain name. Static web hosting is available. And then within Route 53, I'm going to go into my hosted zones, clicking on the domain name, and I'm going to create a record set. So the record set, you can see the name is something brianwitkowski.com. I just want it to be brianwitkowski.com, so that's fine. And then I have it set up as an alias. And then because I've created the S3 bucket in that way, meaning it's named the same as my domain name, and it's set up as a static host, then the alias target will show up here. So I should be able to choose my S3 bucket, and I'm not seeing it here. So I just want to go to my static hosting, and I'm going to grab this URL. This is going to be my endpoint, and then I'm going to go ahead and create it. And apparently I had the wrong, let me try that again. I'm going to create a record set. I'm leaving it. Yes, I'm using an alias, and then you can see Brian Witkowski, it's an S3 website, and it just grabbed it, so I'm going to go ahead and create that. Okay, so now what I want to check is if I go out to a new tab and I go to brianwitkowski.com, you'll notice that I am getting Cloud for Developers, and then you can see it's this S3 title. So we're rendering that out. We can verify that that's working by skipping over to Adam, we're gonna just change the title to say that it was updated. And then I'm gonna upload this to my S3 bucket. So here we go over to my S3 bucket. I'm just going to upload a new index.html file sitting on my desktop. And I have to make it publicly accessible, otherwise I'm going to have problems. And it was just modified. So now if I refresh the page, and I'm going to have to pull this off, but you'll notice that the title has that updated in it. So you can see that this site is getting rendered from my S3 bucket. Okay, so BrianWitkowski.com right now is pointing at my S3 bucket. Okay, life's good there. So that's one way I can host a website. The second way that I could host a website, so I'm going to close out of S3 now because we kind of hit on that. I want to go into EC2. So EC2, I have one running instance. It's a Ubuntu Linux instance, and Apache's been installed. So I have this public IP address. If I copy that to my clipboard, I should be able to see that page. Okay, so here it is. And what I want to do is I want to point my Route 53 over to that EC2 instance. So right now we've set this up so that it's an alias pointing at an S3 bucket. What I want to do is I want to say, no, it's not an alias. Instead, what it's going to do is it's going to point to a specific IP address. And I'm grabbing that IP address here from my EC2 console. I also should mention that this EC2 instance, there are some inbound rules. So I'm allowing port 80 traffic, so HTTP traffic is fine. Okay, so my firewall has that hole in it so that I can see the site. Back to Route 53, I enter the IP address of my EC2 instance, and I'm going to go ahead and save that record set. Okay, so before we were using this IP address, now I'm just going to use the domain name, and you'll notice it doesn't change. So you'll notice the title is Cloud for Developers. What I want to do is I want to change the title to Cloud for Developers -EC2. Okay, so I'm changing that page. And then I'm going to come out to a command prompt and push this. So I'm going to do an SCP command, -I, and then my key file, I can't remember what the key file name is, but it's Cloud for Devs. And then the way this is going to work is I want to push index.html using my Ubuntu account. And now I can use my domain name. And then I have to specify the location that I want to push it to. So var www.html. Okay, it copied that new file. And now if I refresh the page, you'll notice that I get Cloud for Developers EC2. So at this point, Route 53 is now pointing at my EC2 instance. I do want to point out that my EC2 instance, this IP address, is not a static IP address. So if I were to shut down this instance or resize the instance or add storage to the instance, that IP address will get changed. So if I really wanted to have a domain name that's pointing at this EC2 instance and be able to shut down the EC2 instance and change it and modify it and ramp it up, scale it however I want, I'd want to use an elastic IP. And what the elastic IP does is it basically says, look, this IP address is kind of a permanent thing. I do pay extra for it, but it's a permanent thing that's always pointing at this EC2 instance. And then I could use that elastic IP address as opposed to the public IP4 IP address that I'm putting into Route 53. Okay, so now we're hosting an EC2 instance, and we're using a domain name to point at EC2. So I'm going to go ahead and close EC2 because we've kind of tackled that issue. Okay, so life's good there. Now within Lambda, I have an HTML page that's rendering, and the code for the HTML page, so you'll notice the title is Cloud for Developers -API Gateway, because like I said at the beginning of the video, we're not actually going to be pointing at our Lambda function, we're going to be pointing at API Gateway. And then index.js, this file, is just reading the contents of the HTML file and returning it. Okay, so this is what it looks like. Now what I want to do is I want to go over to API Gateway and show you what I did there. So we're basically going to create an API pointing at this service. Okay, so here's the API that's pointing at this service. So it's website demo. All there is a get that's pointed at that HTML web page Lambda function. A couple of things about this though. is my method response. If I actually want to see an HTML page, by default, API Gateway is going to send back JSON. So in my method response, I had to set a content type. Okay, so the content type has to be there in the method response. And then in the integration response, I actually set that header mapping content type to text/HTML. Okay, so this is an important step. So this mapping value should not be application/JSON, it should be text/HTML. The other thing that I have to do is when I hit text/HTML, I'm going to take the input path, the $sign, so I'm basically taking all the output and then passing it through is what's going on with that template. Okay, so then eventually we're going to get to stages. I have one stage, which is production, and I can invoke that stage. And you'll notice I get Cloud for Developers, Hello World, and the title shows API Gateway. So this is what I want to point my Route 53 DNS server to. Okay, and this takes a little bit more work. So I just want to walk you through that process of getting API Gateway set up as your website. So within API Gateway, I have to have a custom domain name. And the custom domain name has to match my domain name that I have registered within Route 53. I can make it a subdomain, which is what I want to do in this case. So I want the domain name that I'm going to use for this API to be api-brianwitkowski.com. So I want to create that custom domain name. In order to do that, I'm going to need a certificate. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open up the certificate manager. Okay, I'm going to request a certificate, so request a public certificate, and the domain name that I want to use is api.brianwitkowski.com. I'm going to hit next. I'm going to do DNS validation because I'm in control of all of this, so I have permission to change my DNS configuration. That's fine. I'm not tagging it. And I'm ready to confirm and request it. Okay, so it's saying it's pending a validation. So I could export the configuration and then bring it over to Route 53, but it's actually all integrated in AWS. So I can create that CNAME record right here in Route 53. So it's all integrated together, so it's telling me how to do it. But I'm going to go ahead and create the record in Route 53. Okay, so now Route 53 has a CNAME record for api.brianwitkowski.com. It tells me it's going to take 30 minutes for the changes to propagate. I found that it doesn't take 30 minutes, but it does take, I mean, it's not instantaneous. So it tells me the validation's not complete, and I do need the validation to happen, I think, in order for this to work, but we can try to go back over to API Gateway and see. So I want to create a custom domain name, and the custom domain name that I want to create is api.brianwitkowski.com. It matches the certificate. My endpoint, I have a couple of different things that I can do. A regional endpoint basically just means it's within my AWS region, as opposed to using CloudFront, which is basically a caching service. So it'll cache this API on all of the different regions, the different AWS regions. I don't need to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to choose my certificate. So here's my api.brianwitkowski.com certificate, and I'm going to create that. And then what I want to do is if I scroll down to the bottom, you'll see this API mappings. And what it's basically saying is when I go to that custom domain, what service within my API should actually be my home page, essentially. Okay, and so if I go to configure mappings, I'm going to add a new mapping. The API that I want is for my website, and the stage that I want is production. So if you remember back to my APIs, I'm going to open this in a new tab. So when I was looking at my website, I had to go into my specific stage, my production stage, and that was part of the URL. so you can see that production is part of the URL. Within the API mappings, I can say that my custom domain name is going to map to a specific stage, so then that stage wouldn't need to be part of my URL. Okay, so now my URL is just going to be my custom domain name. Okay, so that's all saved. And then I have this API gateway domain name. This API gateway domain name is not publicly accessible. Okay, it's not, but I do need to copy it. So I'm going to copy it to my clipboard. And I'm going to use that API gateway domain name as an alias in Route 53. And I'll show you what I mean here in a second. So if I go over to Route 53, I have this DNS entry. And right now it's set up for brianwitkowski.com. That's fine. What I want to do is I want to create a new record set. And the new record set is going to be api.brianwitkowski.com. It's going to be an IP4 address, and yes, there's an alias. In my alias target, if I scroll down, you'll see that I don't have any API gateway APIs yet, but I'm just going to go ahead and paste that public domain name from API gateway, and I'm going to create this record set. Okay, so now I have a record for api.brianwitkowski.com that should be pointing at API gateway to this custom domain. And now, if we try this out, you'll see that I get Cloud for Developers Hello World, and you'll notice the title's changed so that it's pointing at API gateway. Okay, so this video kind of walks you through the intricacies of using a domain name within Route 53 to access the various different AWS services that we've used to create websites, whether it be S3 or EC2 or a combination of API gateway with Lambda. Okay, so this video is just kind of giving you an overview of that hosting process. I do want to point out that there is charges associated with creating a Route 53 domain name. So I think it's $12 for a .com domain name, and it was pretty upfront about that. One thing I will note about that is even if you have AWS credits, so some of you might have AWS credits because you're a student or you're some kind of developer program where you have AWS credits, those credits cannot be applied to domain name services. So there is a fee associated with creating that domain name, and I don't want anyone to be surprised by that.